The village well was contaminated, the river ran brown with sewage, but somehow the local brewery produced ale that people drank daily without dropping dead. How did medieval brewers create safe beverages in a world where clean water was rarer than gold? And when contaminated ale did kill entire households, who paid the price for a batch gone wrong? Medieval ale wasn't just refreshment, it was survival. In an era when drinking water could mean death from dysentery, cholera, or plague, properly brewed ale provided hydration that wouldn't kill you. Children drank small ale with breakfast, workers consumed it throughout the day, and even monks relied on brewery output to stay alive through winter months. But transforming contaminated water and moldy grain into safe, nourishing ale required techniques that pushed medieval food science to its absolute limits. The medieval brewery occupied a crucial position in every community, often located near the marketplace where fresh ingredients could be obtained and finished products easily distributed. These weren't the romantic stone buildings of modern imagination, but practical workshops designed around the complex process of transforming grain into alcohol, while avoiding the contamination that could turn life-saving ale into deadly poison. Inside a typical brewery, massive wooden vats dominated the workspace, each one carefully maintained and seasoned for specific stages of the brewing process. Copper kettles, representing enormous investments for medieval businesses, hung over stone hearths designed to provide the precise heat control that proper brewing demanded. The air was thick with the yeasty smell of fermenting grain, the sweet aroma of boiling wort, and the ever-present scent of wood smoke that powered the brewing fires. The most critical feature of any medieval brewery was the water source, and master brewers went to extraordinary lengths to secure supplies that wouldn't contaminate their products. Some breweries had their own wells, dug deep enough to reach water that hadn't been polluted by surface runoff. Others maintained elaborate systems of cisterns and settling tanks that allowed water to be purified through careful filtration and settling processes. The best breweries were built near springs or upstream from population centers, ensuring access to the cleanest possible water. But clean water was just the beginning. The brewing process itself had to transform potentially dangerous ingredients into safe, stable products that could be stored and consumed over weeks or months. This required understanding fermentation principles that wouldn't be scientifically explained for centuries. Yet medieval brewers achieved results that modern microbiologists recognize as remarkably sophisticated. The Brewers Guild exercised control over ale production that was stricter than almost any other food-related trade, and for compelling reasons. Bad bread might cause stomach upset, but contaminated ale could kill dozens of people within days. Guild regulations specified everything from acceptable ingredients to storage requirements, fermentation times, and the testing procedures that determined whether finished ale was safe for public consumption. Apprenticeship in brewing required extensive education about food safety principles that were understood empirically rather than scientifically. Apprentices learned to recognize the visual, aromatic, and tactile signs that indicated whether ingredients were suitable for brewing, whether fermentation was proceeding properly, and whether finished products were safe for consumption. They studied the subtle differences between beneficial fermentation and dangerous spoilage, knowledge that required years to master completely. Master brewers maintained detailed records of every batch they produced, noting ingredients, timing, weather conditions, and any unusual circumstances that might affect the final product. These records served multiple purposes: quality control, troubleshooting when problems occurred, and most importantly, evidence in legal proceedings if contaminated ale caused illness or death. Guild bylaws specified severe penalties for brewers whose products caused harm, including financial compensation to victims' families and possible banishment from the trade. The Guild also controlled access to the highest quality ingredients, particularly the hops and specialty grains that distinguished premium ales from common beverages. Members who violated safety protocols or quality standards faced graduated punishments ranging from fines to complete exclusion from ingredient suppliers, effectively ending their brewing careers. But beyond enforcement, the Guild preserved centuries of accumulated knowledge about safe brewing practices, techniques passed down through generations of master brewers who had learned through trial, error, and occasional tragedy. The selection and preparation of grains for brewing required expertise that combined agricultural knowledge with food science principles that medieval brewers understood intuitively. Not every grain harvest was suitable for brewing, and even good grain could be ruined by improper storage or preparation. Master brewers developed techniques for evaluating grain quality that went far beyond simple visual inspection. The most critical aspect of grain selection involved identifying contamination that could make finished ale dangerous to consume. Grain that had been stored improperly might harbor molds that produced toxins capable of causing serious illness or death. Wet conditions during harvest or storage could promote bacterial growth that would survive the brewing process and contaminate finished products. Master brewers learned to detect these problems through careful examination of grain color, smell, texture, and even the way it behaved during preparation. The malting process, where grain was deliberately sprouted to convert starches into fermentable sugars, required precise control of moisture, temperature, and timing that pushed medieval technology to its limits. The grain had to be soaked in clean water for exact periods, then spread in controlled environments where it could sprout without developing the molds and bacteria that would contaminate the final product. This process often took weeks and required constant attention to prevent spoilage. Temperature control during malting was achieved through careful management of the environments where grain was processed. Malting floors were designed with drainage systems that prevented standing water, ventilation that promoted proper air circulation, and heating systems that could maintain consistent temperatures without creating hotspots where harmful microorganisms could proliferate. Master brewers could judge proper malting conditions by subtle environmental cues, adjusting their techniques based on seasonal variations and local climate conditions. The brewing process itself began with mashing, where malted grain was combined with hot water to extract the sugars that would eventually become alcohol. This wasn't simply a matter of mixing ingredients, but a precisely controlled chemical process that had to extract maximum nutrition while avoiding the contamination that could make finished ale dangerous. The water had to be heated to exact temperatures using fuel that wouldn't impart off flavors or contaminants to the mixture. Master brewers used specialized equipment designed for precise temperature control during mashing. Copper vessels distributed heat evenly and could be cleaned thoroughly between batches, preventing the buildup of residues that might harbor dangerous bacteria. Stone platforms under brewing kettles prevented contamination from floors while providing stable bases for heavy equipment. The stirring implements, measuring tools, and transfer equipment were all designed to maintain sanitation while allowing brewers to monitor and control every aspect of the process. The addition of hops represented one of the most important innovations in medieval brewing, not just for flavor but for safety. Hops contained natural antibacterial compounds that helped preserve finished ale and prevented the growth of harmful microorganisms during storage. The timing and quantity of hop additions had to be calculated precisely to achieve the right balance between preservation and palatability. But hops weren't the only preservative technique available to medieval brewers. Some used herbs and spices that had natural antimicrobial properties, creating ales with distinctive flavors while extending their safe storage life. Others developed techniques for creating higher alcohol content that would inhibit bacterial growth. The most skilled brewers combined multiple preservation methods, creating ales that remained safe and palatable for months after brewing. Fermentation represented the most critical and mysterious stage of medieval brewing, where beneficial yeasts had to convert sugars into alcohol while preventing harmful bacteria from contaminating the product. Medieval brewers didn't understand the microbiology of fermentation, but they developed practical techniques that achieved remarkably consistent results through careful observation and accumulated experience. The management of fermentation required understanding the environmental factors that promoted beneficial yeast activity, while discouraging harmful microorganisms. Temperature had to be controlled within narrow ranges. Air circulation managed to prevent contamination while allowing proper fermentation, and timing carefully monitored to ensure that fermentation proceeded completely without allowing spoilage to begin. Master brewers maintained their own yeast cultures, often for decades, through techniques that kept beneficial microorganisms alive and active, while preventing contamination by harmful bacteria or wild yeasts that could spoil entire batches. These yeast cultures were among a brewery's most valuable assets, representing years of careful cultivation and selection for the specific characteristics that produce superior ale. The testing procedures used to determine whether finished ale was safe for consumption relied on sensory evaluation techniques that medieval brewers refined to remarkable precision. They could detect off flavors, aromas, or visual signs that indicated spoilage or contamination that might not be immediately obvious to untrained consumers. This testing often involved multiple evaluations over several days, ensuring that ale remained stable and safe throughout its expected storage period. Quality control in medieval brewing included procedures that would destroy questionable products rather than risk public safety. Brewers who suspected contamination in their ale were expected to discard entire batches rather than attempt to salvage them through dilution or additional processing. This economic sacrifice was enforced through guild regulations and social pressure, since a brewer's reputation for safety was essential to long-term success. The social hierarchy of medieval society was reflected in the different grades of ale available to various economic classes. The poorest people drank thin, low-alcohol small ale that provided basic hydration and minimal nutrition at affordable prices. Working families could afford common ale with higher alcohol content and better flavor. Wealthy merchants and nobles demanded premium ales made from the finest ingredients and aged for extended periods to develop complex flavors. These quality differences weren't just about taste and alcohol content, but about safety margins built into different products. Premium ales were brewed with the cleanest ingredients, the most careful processes, and the longest aging periods that would kill any contaminating organisms. Small ale for the poor was made quickly from cheaper ingredients, with less margin for error, hearting products that were adequate for basic survival, but carried higher risks of contamination. The economic pressures on brewers who served different market segments created ongoing tension between profitability and safety. Wealthy customers could afford ales made with expensive ingredients and labor-intensive processes that maximized safety. Poor customers needed products cheap enough to afford on laborers' wages, forcing brewers to balance cost reduction against the risks of contamination that could destroy their businesses and harm their communities. Medieval building codes and public health regulations addressed brewing operations through laws that reflected bitter experience with contaminated ale outbreaks. Cities that had experienced mass poisonings from bad ale often required brewers to meet specific construction standards, maintain certain sanitation practices, and submit their products to official testing before public sale. The enforcement of brewing regulations varied significantly between different jurisdictions, creating complex legal environments that successful brewers had to navigate while maintaining profitable operations. Some cities appointed ale tasters, official inspectors who evaluated brewing operations and tested finished products for safety and quality. Others relied on guild self-regulation, holding brewery operators collectively responsible for maintaining standards that protected public health. The legal liability faced by medieval brewers was severe compared to most other trades. A baker whose bread was substandard might face fines or temporary closure, but a brewer whose ale killed customers could face criminal charges, massive compensation claims, and complete destruction of their business and reputation. This legal framework encouraged conservative brewing practices that prioritized safety over innovation or cost reduction. The seasonal rhythms of medieval brewing were driven by the agricultural cycles that determined ingredient availability and the environmental conditions that affected fermentation and storage. The best brewing typically occurred during cooler months when temperature control was easier and spoilage less likely. Summer brewing required additional precautions and often produced lower quality products that couldn't be stored as long. Harvest seasons created intense activity periods, when brewers worked to process large quantities of fresh grain, while it was at peak quality. This required careful planning to ensure adequate storage, equipment, and labor to handle the increased volume without compromising safety standards. Many breweries operated at maximum capacity during autumn months, producing enough ale to supply their communities throughout winter when fresh ingredients were scarce. Winter storage presented unique challenges that required specialized facilities and techniques to maintain ale quality while preventing contamination. Underground cellars provided stable temperatures that slowed spoilage, while careful inventory management ensured that older stock was consumed before it could deteriorate. The most successful breweries developed storage systems that could maintain ale quality for months, providing steady supplies during the lean seasons when fresh brewing was difficult or impossible. The tools and equipment used in medieval brewing represented significant investments that had to be maintained with obsessive care to prevent contamination. Wooden vats were seasoned and treated to prevent bacterial growth, Copper kettles were cleaned and polished to remove any residues that could harbor harmful microorganisms, and transfer equipment was designed to minimize exposure to contamination during the various stages of production. The specialized knowledge required for proper equipment maintenance was as important as brewing technique itself. Master brewers understood how different materials interacted with ale, how to detect equipment problems that might compromise safety, and how to perform maintenance procedures that would extend equipment life while ensuring continued sanitary operation. This knowledge was often specific to individual brewery setups, creating expertise that was difficult to transfer between different operations. The evolution of brewing equipment reflected centuries of refinement aimed at improving both safety and efficiency. Innovations in kettle design, fermentation vessel construction, and storage systems were driven by the constant need to balance cost, capacity, and contamination prevention. The most successful brewing operations invested in equipment upgrades that would improve their ability to produce safe, consistent products, while remaining economically competitive. The knowledge and techniques developed in medieval breweries established principles that influence food and beverage production for centuries. The empirical understanding of fermentation, contamination prevention, and quality control that medieval brewers achieved through careful observation laid foundations for modern food science and industrial brewing methods. The guild system that controlled medieval brewing created professional standards and training methods that evolved into modern certification programs and regulatory frameworks. The emphasis on safety over profit, systematic quality control, and detailed record-keeping established precedents for food safety regulation that continue to influence modern brewing and food production industries. Understanding how medieval brewers made ale, without killing their customers, reveals a world where practical necessity drove remarkable innovations in food safety and production techniques. These craftsmen developed solutions to complex microbiological problems using empirical methods, creating beverage production systems that kept entire communities alive and healthy for generations. The precision and reliability of medieval ale production represented achievements that provided safe alternatives to contaminated water supplies, while creating products that contributed to nutrition and social cohesion in medieval communities. The brewers who perfected these techniques saved countless lives through their dedication to safety and quality, creating a legacy that extends far beyond the beverages they produced. The next time you raise a glass of beer or ale, remember the medieval brewers who first figured out how to transform contaminated water and grain into safe, nourishing beverages. They worked without understanding of microbiology, without modern sanitation methods, without even thermometers to monitor their processes, yet they created brewing systems so effective that their basic principles remain valid today. Their legacy lives on not just in the beverages we enjoy, but in the fundamental understanding that food safety requires knowledge, skill, and unwavering commitment to protecting those who consume our products. If you enjoy the hidden sides of medieval life, hit subscribe and give this video a like.